Fort Knox, Kentucky, spring 1943. The Sherman tank sat in the morning sun like a steel coffin waiting to be filled. Jim Hawthorne stood before it, 19 years old, farm dirt still under his fingernails from Nebraska, and felt his hands shake. Not from cold. The Kentucky spring was warm. Not from excitement. He had volunteered, yes, but standing here now, looking at 30 tons of riveted armor and the dark mouth of its hatch, something ancient and animal in his gut told him to run. The drill sergeant's voice cut through the morning like artillery. "Hawthorne, you afraid of a tank?" Jim's throat was dry. Every other recruit around him stood rigid, eyes forward, but the sergeant was looking at him. Only him. "No, Sergeant." The lie tasted like copper. "Then why are your hands shaking like a virgin in a whorehouse?" Laughter rippled through the formation. Jim felt heat crawl up his neck. "I'm afraid of dying in one, Sergeant." The laughter stopped. The sergeant walked closer, boots crunching gravel, until Jim could smell coffee and tobacco on his breath. The man's face was a roadmap of scars, one eye slightly clouded. He leaned in close. "Good. Fear keeps you alive. Courage gets you moving. You got both. You might make it home." The sergeant stepped back, raised his voice to the full formation. "Listen up. Most of you shit for brains think a tank is a fortress. It ain't. It's a target. A big, loud, slow target that every kraut with a Panzerfaust wants to crack open like a tin can. Your job is to make sure they die before you do." Questions? No one spoke. "Outstanding. Meet your new family." The sergeant gestured, and 4 other soldiers stepped forward from behind the Sherman. Jim studied them, knowing that his life would soon depend on these strangers. The first was tall, dark-haired, with wire-rimmed glasses that seemed impossibly delicate for a soldier. He grinned. "Danny Kowalski, Chicago. They call me Deadeye on account of I never miss. Also on account of I'm half blind without these glasses," which is hilarious if you think about it. The second was smaller, compact, with brown skin and gentle eyes. He didn't smile. "Miguel Reyes, San Antonio. People call me Miggy." He made the sign of the cross, quick and automatic, like breathing. The third was the youngest, maybe 17, though his papers probably said 18. Chinese features, thin shoulders, trying to stand taller than he was. "Tommy Chen, San Francisco. And yeah, I'm American as any of you, so don't start." There was defensiveness in his voice, like he'd had this conversation 100 times before. The sergeant pointed at Jim. "And this is Hawthorne, farm boy from Nebraska. Doesn't like tanks. You 4 are a crew now. Commander, gunner, driver, loader. Figure out who does what. You got 10 minutes before training starts." The sergeant walked away. The 5 of them stood there, suddenly alone with 30 tons of steel and the weight of their ignorance. Deadeye broke the silence. "So who's driving this beast?" Miggy stepped forward. "I can drive anything, tractors, trucks, my uncle's delivery van. I'll drive." "I'll load," Tommy said quickly. "I'm fast and strong, stronger than I look." He said it like he'd been proving it his whole life. Deadeye adjusted his glasses. "Guess that makes me the gunner, which leaves you, farm boy. You're the commander." Jim felt the words land like a physical weight. "I don't know anything about commanding." "None of us know anything about anything," Deadeye said. "But somebody's got to give the orders, and it sure as hell ain't gonna be me. I'm a terrible decision maker. Last week, I bet my entire paycheck on a horse named Lucky. Horse finished last and died a week later." Despite everything, Jim almost smiled. "All right, I'll command." Tommy looked up at the tank, then at Jim. "You think we'll make it? I mean, really?" The question hung in the air. Miggy made the sign of the cross again. Deadeye looked at his boots. Jim thought about lying, about saying something brave and certain. Instead, he told the truth. "I think we'll try." It was the best any of them could hope for. 3 weeks later, Captain Richard Morrison was not what Jim expected. Most officers Jim had met were either screaming martinets or distant aristocrats who regarded enlisted men as a different species. Morrison was neither. He was 38 years old, lean, with gray starting at his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. He also had a habit of showing up unannounced during training exercises, watching from a distance, taking notes in a small leather journal. On the 4th week, after a particularly brutal drill where Jim's crew had failed to hit a moving target 3 times in a row, Morrison approached. "Walk with me, Hawthorne." It wasn't a request. Jim followed, leaving his crew by the tank, Deadeye giving him a questioning look. Morrison led him away from the training field, past the motor pool, to a cluster of administrative buildings Jim had never entered. They walked in silence. Morrison's boots were polished to a mirror shine, but his uniform was worn at the elbows. A working officer. Finally, they stopped outside a storage building. Morrison produced a key, unlocked the door, and gestured inside. After you. The interior was dim, dusty, filled with crates and equipment covered in canvas tarps. Morrison walked to the back corner, pulled aside a tarp, and revealed a wooden crate with German markings stenciled on the side. Captured Panzer III, North Africa, 1942. We shipped the whole thing back, studied it, took it apart. You know what we found inside? Jim shook his head. Morrison reached into the crate and pulled out a manual, pages yellowed, cover worn. He handed it to Jim. Training Doctrine, German Tank Tactics, open it. Jim did. The text was in German, but the diagrams were clear. Arrows showing rapid movement, penetration, encirclement, and in the margins, handwritten notes. Some in German, some in English. Morrison pointed to a page. See those names? Fuller, Liddell Hart, Hobart, British officers, British theorists. The Germans weren't just reading their work. They were studying it like scripture. Jim looked up. I don't understand, sir. Morrison took the manual back, held it like it was precious. 20 years ago, the British Army had an experimental unit. They called it the Experimental Mechanized Force, fastest tanks in the world. Mobile infantry, coordinated air support. They ran exercises that proved tanks could move fast, hit hard, and win battles before the enemy knew what hit them. He paused, his jaw tightening. The British brass disbanded it, said tanks would never replace cavalry. Too radical, too risky, too new. Morrison walked to another crate, pulled out a thin document bound in red tape. This is a U.S. Army intelligence report from 1928. It's an analysis of those British exercises. The conclusion, quote, interesting but impractical for American terrain and strategic needs, end quote. He tossed the report to Jim. It landed at his feet, dust rising. We had the playbook, Hawthorne, both us and the Brits. We saw the future of armored warfare, and then we threw it away because old men loved horses more than they loved winning. Jim picked up the report, scanned the pages. The analysis was detailed, thorough. The author clearly understood what he was seeing, and then, in the final paragraph, dismissed it all as impractical. Sir, why are you telling me this? Morrison looked at him for a long moment. Because you're going to go to France. You're going to fight panzer divisions. And those panzers are going to be using tactics that British and American officers invented and then forgot. The Germans learned. We didn't. And a lot of good men are going to die because of that. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a book. Small, battered, pages dog-eared. This is J.F.C. Fuller's Armored Warfare, published 1932. British officer, tank theorist, absolute genius. Also, possibly insane. Definitely a fascist. Doesn't matter. This book explains how to fight with tanks, how to move, how to think. The Germans have studied it like scripture. Most American officers haven't even heard of it. He handed the book to Jim. I'm giving this to you because I think you can learn. I think you can adapt. And I think you might live long enough to use it. Jim held the book, felt its weight. What do you want me to do, sir? Read it? Understand it? And when you're over there, when some colonel tells you to advance slowly and carefully in formation, you remember that the enemy isn't following that advice. They're moving fast. They're hitting weak points. They're doing what this book teaches. Morrison turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing, Hawthorne. The Army doesn't like officers who think too much. It likes officers who obey. If you start questioning doctrine, you'll make enemies. But if you don't question it, you'll get your crew killed. Choose which bothers you more. He left Jim standing alone in the dusty warehouse, holding a German manual and a British book, feeling like he'd been handed a secret that might save his life or destroy his career. Outside, thunder rumbled, spring storms moving in. Jim opened the book to the first page and began to read. Normandy, France, July 1904. The hedgerows of Normandy were nothing like the training films. In Kentucky, they practiced in open fields, mock battles against other Shermans, everyone moving in clear sight lines, flanking maneuvers executed with textbook precision. Normandy was a maze, ancient walls of earth and root and stone, 10 feet high, dividing the landscape into tiny fields. Every hedgerow was a potential ambush. Every corner was death. Jim's crew had been in France for 36 days. They'd lost the Sherman they trained on an hour or two of the landing, Mechanical failure, transmission seized, had to abandon it on the beach while artillery screamed overhead. They'd been assigned a replacement, a newer model with slightly thicker armor and a slightly better gun. They'd named it Second Chance. So far, they'd used up about 8 chances. Tommy Chen was dead. It happened fast. They'd been moving through a hedgerow gap, Miggy driving carefully, Deadeye scanning for targets, Tommy ready at the loader's position. The Panzerfaust came from the right, a German kid no older than Tommy, hidden in the brush. The shaped charge punched through the thinner side armor, detonated inside. Tommy died before he could scream. The explosion took everything from the waist up. They'd pulled what was left of him out, wrapped it in a tarp, handed it to Graves registration. Deadeye vomited for an hour. Miggy prayed in Spanish, rapid and desperate. Jim just stood there numb, looking at the bloodstain inside the tank that no amount of scrubbing would remove. Their new loader was Billy Marsh, 18 years old from Ohio, skinny and terrified. He'd been in France for 3 days. His first crew had been killed the day he arrived. He climbed into Second Chance and couldn't stop shaking. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Deadeye, cleaning his glasses with a rag that made them dirtier, finally spoke. "Kid, you didn't kill Tommy. The Germans did. Now do your job or you'll die too, and then we'll have to break in another loader. And frankly, I'm tired of learning new names." It was cruel. It was also exactly what Billy needed to hear. He stopped apologizing and started loading shells. They were 3 miles behind the front lines, laggard with the rest of the company, trying to get some sleep before the next push. Jim sat on Second Chance's fender, reading the book by candlelight. He'd read it twice already, but certain passages kept drawing him back. The principles of war remain constant. The methods of war change with technology. To fight yesterday's war with yesterday's methods is to guarantee defeat. Deadeye climbed up beside him, offered a cigarette. Jim took it, even though he didn't smoke. Seemed wrong to refuse. "You really think that book's going to help?" Jim closed it, looked at the cover. "I think it might get us killed if I follow it, and it might get us killed if I don't." That's the most helpful thing anyone said all week. They smoked in silence. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was crying. Someone else was praying. The sounds of men trying to process horror in whatever way they could. "Deadeye, you ever think about what Captain Morrison said? About how we had all this knowledge and just ignored it?" Deadeye blew smoke into the night. "Every day, Commander. Every single day." The British connection. The Sherman's transmission died 3 days later during a move to a new sector. They'd limped to a crossroads where British units were regrouping, a mixed bag of Cromwell tanks and infantry carriers, and Miggy declared the transmission completely finished. "We need parts or a new tank," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "This one's done." Jim radioed battalion, got the usual response. "Parts maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe never. In the meantime, sit tight." So they sat, made camp near a stone farmhouse that was more rubble than building. The British crews were friendly enough, sharing tea that tasted like it had been boiled in a boot, offering cigarettes that were somehow worse than American ones. One of the British officers, a major with a mustache that belonged in a Victorian photograph, wandered over to where Jim sat reading. "That's Fuller's work, isn't it?" Jim looked up, surprised. "Yes, sir, armored warfare." The major sat down heavily, like his legs hurt. He was older than most combat officers, maybe 45, with the kind of weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. "Nigel Ashford, 7th Armored, and before you ask, yes, I'm too old for this, but they needed experienced officers, and here I am." He pulled out a flask, took a long drink, offered it to Jim. Jim declined. "Fuller," Ashford said, looking at the book. "Brilliant bastard, also completely mad. Fascist, Satanist, all sorts of interesting hobbies, but he understood tanks better than anyone." "You knew him, sir?" Ashford laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Knew of him. I was part of something called the Experimental Mechanized Force, 1927. 20 years ago. Feels like a lifetime." Jim sat up straighter. "Captain Morrison told me about that. He said you proved tanks could win battles through speed and mobility." "We did more than prove it, son. We perfected it. Medium Mark II tanks, Carden-Lloyd carriers, mobile artillery, air coordination. We ran exercises across southern England. Other countries sent observers. The Germans sent a lot of observers." Ashford took another drink. "We demonstrated everything the Panzers are doing right now. Everything. The breakthrough tactics, the exploitation, the deep penetration, The combined arms, we called it mobile warfare. We showed it worked. And then the brass disbanded us. Why? Because we were right too soon. Because change is terrifying to men who built their careers on tradition. Because it's easier to love horses than to love the future. He gestured at the ruins around them. Every dead British soldier in France died because old men in London loved cavalry charges more than they loved their own troops. We knew how to fight this war. We knew it 17 years before it started, and we chose not to. Jim thought about Morrison's words, about the American report, about how knowledge without action is just paper. Sir, there was an exercise, Battle of something bridge. Beresford, 1934, Battle of Beresford Bridge. Ashford's voice had gone quiet. Mobile division against conventional forces. We demonstrated rapid exploitation, flanking maneuvers, the whole doctrine. It was beautiful, it was perfect. It was ignored. He stood up, swaying slightly, drunk or exhausted or both. You know what the observers said? They said it was interesting but impractical, that it relied too much on mechanical reliability, that traditional methods were more dependable. He pointed toward the German lines, somewhere beyond the hedgerows. Those traditional methods? They're killing us. And the mechanics they said were unreliable? The Germans figured them out because they actually tried. Ashford stumbled, caught himself on the farmhouse wall. Sorry, bit drunk. Tends to happen when you realize your entire career was a waste and everyone you trained with died for nothing. Jim wanted to say something comforting, couldn't find the words. Sir, it's not for nothing. I'm reading this because Captain Morrison gave me the book. I'm trying to learn. Maybe we can still use it. Ashford looked at him, and for a moment his eyes were completely sober. Then learn fast, son, because the enemy already graduated. He walked away, back to his unit. Jim watched him go, then opened the book again. This time he started taking notes. The next day, the German attack came at dawn, which meant they had maybe 2 hours of warning from the artillery barrage that preceded it. Jim's crew scrambled into second chance, Billy fumbling with shells, Deadeye already scanning through his periscope, Miggy bringing the engine to life. The radio crackled with confusion. German armor pushing through the British lines, headed their direction. How many unknown, type unknown, all units engage. Through the smoke and morning mist, Jim saw them. Tiger tanks, 2 of them, and behind them, infantry and half-tracks. Deadeye target left. I see him, Jesus Christ, I see him. The Sherman's gun was a 75 millimeter. Good against other Shermans, mediocre against Panthers, nearly useless against Tigers, frontally. But they'd learned in training that Tigers had weak side armor. The problem was getting to their side. Jim made a decision. Speed over firepower, maneuver over confrontation. Miggy, hard left. Get us into that tree line, we're going around. Commander, that's not what battalion said. They said hold position and engage. Battalion's not in a Sherman facing a Tiger. Move. Miggy moved. Second chance surged forward, engine screaming, tracks churning mud. The Tigers were focused on the British Cromwells, which were bravely and stupidly charging straight at them. Gallant, suicidal, traditional. Jim's Sherman slipped into the trees parallel to the German advance, hidden by smoke and morning fog. They moved fast, flanking wide, circling around. Deadeye, when we come out, you'll have maybe 2 seconds before they turn their turret. Make it count. No pressure or anything. They burst from the tree line. The Tiger's side armor, only 80 millimeters, was exposed. Deadeye didn't hesitate. Firing! The 75 millimeter barked. The round punched through the Tiger's side into the engine compartment. The tank didn't explode. It didn't brew up in flames, it just stopped. Smoke pouring from its vents, crew bailing out. One down. The second Tiger was already turning. Jim didn't wait for it. Miggy, reverse! Back into the trees! They disappeared into cover just as the Tiger's 88 millimeter shell screamed past, close enough that Jim felt the heat through the armor. Billy, load smoke. Smoke! But Commander! Load smoke! Billy loaded. They fired. The smoke shell burst in front of the Tiger, creating a white wall. They used the cover to move again. Repositioning, staying mobile, never where the enemy expected. It took 20 minutes. 3 smoke shells, 2 repositions, and 1 shot into the Tiger's rear armor while it was distracted by the British Cromwells. The second Tiger burned. When it was over, when the German infantry retreated and the smoke cleared, Jim's crew sat in stunned silence. Billy spoke first. That's not how they taught us. Deadeye was shaking, adrenaline crash hitting hard. That's because they taught us wrong. Miggy made the sign of the cross. We should be dead. By every tactical doctrine, we should be dead. Jim looked at the book, tucked beside his seat. Maybe doctrine's the problem. Outside, they could hear the British crews cheering. Ashford appeared beside the tank, grinning wildly. That was pure mobility, speed and surprise. Attack where they're weak. Then his expression changed. His second in command was running toward them, shouting something. Ashford's face went pale. What? The second in command grabbed his arm. Sir, the Germans broke through on the right. Third squadron is getting hammered. We need to move now. Ashford looked at Jim, then at his own tank. Bloody hell, right, let's go. He climbed into his Cromwell. The British tanks moved out, heading toward the sound of guns. Jim watched them go, something cold settling in his stomach. 2 hours later, a runner brought the news. Major Nigel Ashford's Cromwell had been hit by a panther. The tank had burned. Ashford and his entire crew were dead. Jim stood outside Second Chance holding the book and wanted to throw it into the mud. Wanted to scream. Wanted to ask what the point was of learning the right tactics if you died anyway. Deadeye put a hand on his shoulder. It's not the book's fault, Jim. It was the first time Deadeye had used his first name. It felt significant. He knew Danny, he knew everything. He was there when they figured it out, and it didn't save him. Maybe, but it saved us today. And tomorrow, maybe it saves someone else. Jim looked at his gunner, at his friend. You really believe that? Deadeye adjusted his glasses, smudged with smoke and grease. I have to, otherwise what are we doing? Jim didn't have an answer, so he opened the book and kept reading. The Falaise Pocket, August 1944. By the time they reached the Falaise Pocket, Jim's battalion had been in continuous combat for 62 days. Second Chance was on its third engine, second gun, and had been patched with so much welded armor that it weighed half a ton more than factory specifications. Billy had stopped shaking. Miggy had stopped praying, or at least stopped praying out loud. Deadeye had stopped making jokes. They'd become what combat makes of men. Harder, quieter, more efficient, less human. The Falaise Pocket was chaos. German forces trying to escape encirclement, Allied forces trying to close the trap. Thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of soldiers, all compressed into a shrinking area of Norman countryside. The air stank of burning fuel and rotting corpses. Jim's company commander, Captain Fletcher, called the tank commanders together for a briefing. Objective is Hill 204. German rearguard is dug in. We advance at 0600, 2 companies abreast. Artillery support on call. Any questions? Jim looked at the map. The route Fletcher proposed was direct. Obvious. The Germans would be expecting it. They'd have the approaches pre-sighted for artillery. Sir, what if we bypass Hill 204, swing wide to the east, cut off their escape route? If they're trying to retreat anyway, we don't need to take the hill. We just need to block the road behind it. Fletcher looked at him like he'd suggested surrendering. Lieutenant Hawthorne, the objective is Hill 204. I didn't ask for alternative proposals. Sir, the operational concept suggests that in exploitation operations, bypassing strong points allows. I don't care what some British theorists suggested 20 years ago. I care about following orders from battalion. We take Hill 204, understood? Jim bit back his response. Yes, sir. But after the briefing, as they walked back to their tanks, Deadeye muttered, Fuller's probably rolling in his grave. If he's dead, is he dead? I think he's still alive, Jim said. And yes, he's probably very disappointed. At 0600, they advanced, exactly as the Germans expected. The artillery came down like the wrath of God. Jim's platoon, thank God or luck or fate, was on the far right of the advance. When the first shells hit, he made a decision that would later get him screamed at by 3 different officers. All tanks, Hawthorne. Break right. We're going around. Say again, Hawthorne. Break right? Affirmative, wide flanking maneuver. Follow me. They peeled off from the main advance, 4 Shermans moving fast through a gap in the German coverage. Behind them, Jim could hear the company channel filling with confused chatter, officers demanding to know what he was doing, where he was going. He switched off the radio. Miggy, full speed. Deadeye, scan left. Anything moves, you light it up. They moved like ghosts, like the wind, like everything written in that book. Behind Hill 204, circling wide, finding the road the Germans needed to retreat. And there they were, a column of German vehicles, trucks, and half-tracks trying to escape the pocket. No tanks, just soft targets. Jim's platoon hit them like a hammer. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The Germans had no time to deploy, no room to maneuver. In 15 minutes, Jim's 4 tanks destroyed an entire convoy. Trucks burned, men scattered. The road was blocked. When they returned to American lines, Jim expected medals. Instead, he got court-martialed. Captain Fletcher was apoplectic. You disobeyed a direct order. You broke formation. You abandoned your position in the advance. Do you understand that if the Germans had counterattacked, you would have left a gap in our lines? They were in a command tent, Fletcher pacing, Jim standing at attention, muddy and exhausted. Sir, we achieved the objective. Hill 204 fell because the Germans couldn't retreat. Their entire supply column, I don't care if you captured Hitler himself. You violated military discipline. You think you're smarter than the entire chain of command? You think your British book makes you a tactical genius? Jim said nothing. There was nothing to say. Fletcher was right about the disobedience. Jim was right about the tactics. Both things were true. I'm recommending disciplinary action, possibly reduction in rank, possibly worse. Dismissed. Jim saluted, turned to leave. Outside the tent, Captain Morrison was waiting. He looked older than Jim remembered. More gray hair, deeper lines. The weight of this war was crushing everyone. Walk with me, Lieutenant. They walked through the motor pool, past rows of tanks being repaired, past medics treating wounded, past all the machinery of war. Finally, Morrison spoke. You did the right thing today. Captain Fletcher doesn't think so. Fletcher's an idiot. Good officer by peacetime standards, but this isn't peacetime. You saved lives today. You achieved the objective with minimal casualties. By any rational metric, you succeeded. Morrison stopped, turned to face Jim. But the Army doesn't run on rational metrics. It runs on obedience. And you disobeyed. So now you're going to be punished for succeeding. So what do I do, sir? You accept the punishment. You keep your head down. And you remember this feeling because it's going to happen again. Morrison pulled out a cigarette, lit it, offered one to Jim. This time Jim took it. Hawthorne, I'm going to tell you something that might end my career if you repeat it. The American Army is not designed to win wars efficiently. It's designed to win wars acceptably, meaning we'll take more casualties and move slower if it means maintaining discipline and order, because discipline and order are what prevent armies from collapsing into mobs. He blew smoke into the evening air. The theorists were right. The British demonstration was right, but they were asking armies to change fundamentally, and institutions would rather die than change. Remember that. Jim smoked in silence, processing. Sir, was it worth it, what I did today? Morrison looked at him for a long time. Ask me again when this war is over, if we both survive that long. He walked away, leaving Jim alone with his cigarette and his doubts. In the end, the punishment was mild. Official reprimand, no promotion for 6 months. Could have been worse. Fletcher wanted worse. But Morrison's report, filed quietly through different channels, emphasized results over methods. Jim's crew didn't care about any of it. We're alive, Deadeye said. That's what matters. Billy, who'd been silent through most of the controversy, finally spoke. Commander, are you going to keep doing it, using those tactics? Jim looked at the book, now so worn the cover was falling off. Yes, even if they punish you, especially then. Miggy made the sign of the cross. Then we follow you. Right, Deadeye? Deadeye cleaned his glasses, a gesture Jim now recognized as his way of processing stress. To hell and back, Commander. To hell and back. Germany, March 1945. The Rhine crossing was supposed to be impossible. The German High Command believed it. The Allied High Command worried about it. Everyone from Eisenhower down to the newest private knew that crossing a major river under fire was where attacks went to die. Jim's battalion crossed in 23 minutes with acceptable losses. They'd been reassigned to a different unit, one that appreciated initiative over rigid doctrine. The new battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, was younger, harder, more willing to try new approaches. Hawthorne, your platoon is going in the first wave. Your job is to get across fast, establish a bridgehead, and hold it until the engineers can build a proper bridge. Questions? No, sir. Good. Because if you screw this up, we'll all die. But if you succeed, you'll save a lot of lives. Dismissed. The assault was violent, chaotic, and ultimately successful. Jim's platoon led a mixed force of tanks and infantry across the Rhine using a hastily assembled pontoon bridge that swayed and buckled under the weight of their Shermans. They took casualties. One tank was hit crossing, burned on the bridge, had to be pushed into the river to clear the way. But they established the bridgehead, held it against counterattacks, and by nightfall, the bridge was secure. For this, Jim was finally promoted. First lieutenant to captain, 21 years old, commanding a tank company. Deadeye's only comment was, about damn time. But the promotion meant something else. It meant access. It meant being present at briefings. It meant seeing captured intelligence. 1 week after the Rhine crossing, Jim's company overran a German panzer training facility near Paderborn. The Germans had retreated in such haste that they'd left everything behind. Tanks, half-tracks, supplies, and most importantly, the training library. Jim walked through the building with a sense of déjà vu. It reminded him of that warehouse at Fort Knox where Morrison had first shown him the truth. The library was extensive, books in German, obviously, but also translations, French military theory, Russian doctrine, and an entire section dedicated to British armored warfare. Jim picked up a book at random, opened it. Fuller's name stared back at him. This book was in German, but the author's name was unchanged. Bewegungskrieg mit Panzerverbanden. Mobile warfare with tank units. The translator's note indicated it was based on work from 1932. He picked up another book. Liddell Hart, another. Hobart, another. Martel. The entire British school of thought, translated, studied, annotated. A German officer's notebook lay on a desk. Jim opened it. The handwriting was careful, precise. The notes dated back to 1935. June 12, 1940, attended British maneuvers, Salisbury Plain, observed rapid mobile exploitation by experimental force. Tactics align with theoretical framework. Recommend adoption for panzer divisions. Jim turned pages, more notes. British exercises, British theory, British tactics. All studied, absorbed, improved upon by German officers who understood that good ideas don't have nationalities. Deadeye came in, saw Jim surrounded by books, sat down. Let me guess, we invented this stuff and they learned it better. Yes. And now we're here, fighting them, using the same tactics they learned from us, which we forgot. Yes. Deadeye took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes. You know what the really stupid part is? We're going to win this war. We're going to win because we have more tanks, more planes, more everything. And then we're going to go home and forget these lessons all over again. Jim wanted to argue, couldn't. Maybe it'll be different. Maybe. Neither of them believed it. April 1945, the choice. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. The German army was collapsing, falling back toward Berlin, disintegrating unit by unit. Jim's company was advancing through a small German town, one of hundreds they'd passed through, when they encountered the Panzer IV. It was a late model, good gun, decent armor. It was also crewed by children. Jim saw them through his binoculars. The commander couldn't have been more than 16. The gunner looked 14. They were in Hitler Youth uniforms, too large for their thin frames. Deadeye, you have the shot? I have the shot, Commander. Clean kill. The Panzer IV was in a hull-down position, partially hidden behind rubble. But Deadeye was right. It was an easy shot. Hold fire. Say again? Hold fire. I'm going to try to get them to surrender. Deadeye didn't argue, but Jim heard the doubt in his silence. Jim stood up in the commander's hatch, exposed, and raised a white flag. It was incredibly stupid. He knew it was stupid, but these were children. Achtung! Surrender, you're surrounded. The war is over. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Panzer IV's turret began to turn. Jim dropped back into the tank. Miggy, reverse! Deadeye! The German gun fired. The shot hit Second Chance's front slope, angled armor deflecting most of the energy, but the impact was massive. Everyone inside was thrown against their positions. Billy screamed. Miggy's head hit the driver's periscope, blood streaming from his forehead. But worse, the shot had penetrated the driver's compartment. Just barely. Just enough. Miggy was screaming. Not words, just sound. The kind of sound that comes from pain too large for language. Jim looked down, saw the hole in the armor, saw what it had done to Miggy. Deadeye, fire! Fire now! Deadeye fired. The 75mm shell hit the Panzer IV dead center. The German tank exploded, ammunition cooking off in a secondary blast that sent the turret cartwheeling through the air. But Miggy was still screaming. They got him out. Medics came running. Jim held his hand while they worked, while Miggy's blood soaked into the spring mud. Jim, I can't. Stay with me, Miggy, stay with me. But he didn't. Somewhere between the tank and the aid station, Miguel Reyes, who had driven Second Chance across France and Germany, who made the sign of the cross before every battle, who talked about his family in San Antonio and dreamed of going home, died. They buried him 2 days later. Quick service. Too many dead to make them elaborate. Billy sobbed openly. Deadeye stood rigid, glasses reflecting the gray German sky. Jim stood apart from them, looking at the grave, and thought about the book, about maneuver warfare and rapid exploitation and all the elegant theory that never mentioned this. That night, Jim walked to where the destroyed Panzer IV still smoldered. German graves registration hadn't collected the bodies yet. They were stretched thin, too. He looked at the burned crew, looked at the one who'd been the gunner, the kid who looked 14, still wearing his too large helmet. The kid had killed Miggy. Jim had killed the kid. Both true, both necessary, both pointless. Jim found the kid's paybook, somehow intact. Read the name, Carl Hoffman. Birth date, March 1931. 14 years old. Exactly. He put the paybook back in the burned pocket. Moses Washington appeared beside him. Moses was new to the crew, replacing another casualty. 28 years old, a Tuskegee airman who'd washed out for eyesight problems and transferred to armor. Smart, quiet, becoming Jim's closest confidant. Captain, Sergeant, they stood in silence. Finally, Moses spoke. Was it the right call, trying to get them to surrender? Jim didn't answer immediately. I don't know, but you'd do it again. I don't know that either. Moses nodded, like that was answer enough. Miggy talked about you last week. Said you were the best commander he'd ever served under. Said you kept trying to do the right thing even when it cost you. Didn't keep him alive. No, but maybe that's not the measure. Maybe the measure is whether you tried. Jim looked at the burned Panzer, at the dead child inside. Moses, the book talks about exploitation, maneuver, surprise. Never talks about moments like this. What do you do when the right tactical decision and the right moral decision aren't the same thing? Moses was quiet for a long time. I don't think there's a book that covers that, Captain. They walked back to their lines. Behind them, the Panzer IV continued to smolder in the darkness. VE Day, May 8, 1945. When the war ended, Jim's company was somewhere in Bavaria. Nobody quite sure of their exact position. Radio full of celebratory messages. Men cheering and crying and getting drunk on liberated German beer. Jim sat on Second Chance's fender, the book in his hands, and felt nothing. Deadeye climbed up beside him. They'd served together for 2 years now. Felt like 20. We made it, Commander. Some of us. Tommy, Miggy, and the others. There had been others. Replacements. Some lasted weeks. Some lasted days. Jim had stopped learning their names after a while. It hurt less that way. You think it was worth it? Deadeye asked. The war, everything. Jim thought about the book. About the British Experimental Mechanized Force in 1927. About all the knowledge gained and lost and rediscovered through blood. Ask me again in 20 years. See if we learned anything. Billy Marsh approached, younger than he had any right to be after everything he'd seen. Sirs, there's a briefing. They're talking about sending us to the Pacific. Invasion of Japan. Deadeye groaned. Jesus Christ, more war. But Jim felt something stir. Not enthusiasm, but purpose, maybe. If we go prepared. Everything we learned here, we teach to the new guys. Maybe this time the lessons stick. Moses joined them, a bottle of wine in hand. To the fallen, they passed the bottle around. Toasted Miggy, Tommy, Ashford, all the others who'd paid for the lessons. Jim opened the book one last time. The pages were falling out now, stained with mud and blood and the residue of 2 years of war. The principles of war remain constant, he read aloud. The methods of war change with technology. Those who adapt survive. Those who don't, die. He closed the book. We survived. Let's make sure we deserve to. In the distance, fireworks or flares lit the German night. The war in Europe was over. But Jim knew in his bones that wars never really ended. They just paused, waiting for the next generation to relearn everything the last generation forgot. He looked at his crew, at Deadeye, who'd been with him since Fort Knox, at Billy, who'd lost his innocence in a Norman hedgerow, at Moses, who joined them for the final push. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Agreed? They agreed, because in the end, the tanks were just steel. The tactics were just theory. What mattered was the men beside you and whether you could look them in the eye when it was over. Jim could, barely. It would have to be enough. Fort Benning, Georgia, June 1950. 5 years of peace had made Jim Hawthorne soft in ways he didn't recognize until the telegram arrived. He was 26 years old, teaching armored tactics to new lieutenants who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, living in base housing with a wife he'd married too quickly and understood too little, trying to forget the faces of dead men by pretending they'd never existed. The telegram was brief. North Korean forces had crossed the 38th parallel. The Korean peninsula was at war. All officers with combat experience were being recalled to active duty assignments. Jim's wife, Sarah, found him at the kitchen table that evening, the telegram beside an untouched dinner, staring at nothing. "You're going back." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Can you refuse?" He could have lied, should have lied. Instead, he told the truth. "I don't want to refuse." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Sarah left the kitchen. The spare bedroom door closed with a sound like a coffin lid. Their marriage had been dying slowly for 3 years. This would finish it. Jim picked up the phone, dialed a number he hadn't called in 18 months. Deadeye Kowalski answered on the third ring. "Danny, it's Jim. You get the telegram?" A long pause, then a laugh that held no joy. "Yeah, I got it. Was hoping you'd call." "You going?" "Are you?" "Yes." "Then I'm going. Somebody's got to keep you from getting shot." 2 weeks later, they shipped out to Korea. Sarah didn't come to see him off. Jim didn't blame her. Pusan Perimeter, August 1950. The heat in Korea was different from Europe. Wetter, heavier, the kind of heat that made every breath feel like drowning. Jim stood beside his new tank, an M26 Pershing, better armored and better gunned than the Sherman, but somehow less reliable, and watched the chaos of the Pusan Perimeter with a sense of sick familiarity. They were losing, badly. North Korean T-34 tanks, Soviet-built and well-crewed, were slaughtering American M24 Chaffee light tanks like wolves among sheep. The Chafees were fast, lightly armored, designed for reconnaissance. Someone in their infinite wisdom had sent them to fight medium tanks. It was Normandy again. Different continent, same mistakes. Deadeye appeared beside him, older now, 32, his glasses held together with electrical tape. "They didn't learn a damn thing, did they?" Jim watched another Chaffee brew up in the distance, black smoke rising into the humid air. "No, they didn't." "So what do? We fight smarter, and we hope they don't court-martial us for it." Their platoon consisted of 4 M26 Pershings. Jim commanded one. Billy Marsh, now a lieutenant, commanded another. The other 2 were led by officers Jim didn't know yet. Green, untested. But his gunner was Deadeye. His loader was Moses Washington, who'd stayed in the Army after the war, became a sergeant, and specifically requested assignment to Jim's unit. "Figured you'd need someone to keep you honest," Moses had said when they reunited at the embarkation point. Their driver was new. Eddie Moretti, 20 years old from Brooklyn, drafted 6 months ago, hated the Army with a passion that would have been funny if it wasn't so desperate. "I was supposed to start college," Eddie said for the 100th time. "Columbia, pre-law. Now I'm in a tank in Korea." "Korea, I didn't even know where Korea was 6 months ago." "None of us did," Deadeye muttered. The company commander called a briefing. Officers gathered around a map spread on the hood of a Jeep. Captain Brenner, 45 years old, career officer, veteran of nothing but peacetime garrison duty. "Gentlemen, our orders are to hold the line here." He pointed to a position on the map. "We dig in, establish a defensive perimeter, and wait for the North Koreans to attack. Artillery will provide support. Air support on call. Questions?" Jim looked at the map, looked at the terrain, looked at the obvious approach routes the enemy would use. "Sir, if we hold static positions, the T-34s will just sit back and shell us. Their 85mm gun outranges our 90mm. We need to stay mobile, force them to move, hit them when they're exposed." Brenner looked at him like he'd spoken in Korean. "Captain Hawthorne, I don't know how you fought in Europe, but here we follow doctrine. Armor provides a mobile defensive platform. We don't go chasing the enemy around the countryside." "Sir, that's not what armor is for. Fuller's principles clearly state, I don't care what some British theorist said 30 years ago. I care about current U.S. Army doctrine. We hold the line, dismissed." After the briefing, Billy pulled Jim aside. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Pushing, questioning, being right when nobody wants to hear it." Jim lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. "Not from fear, from frustration. Billy, I watched men die in France because officers were too stupid or too stubborn to adapt. I'm not watching it happen again. Then be smart about it. Pick your battles. Save the crew that matters." "Which crew is that? Mine? Yours? The guy next door who's going to burn because his commander follows doctrine?" Billy had no answer for that. The first engagement. The North Koreans attacked at dawn 3 days later, which gave them about 30 minutes of advantage before the American artillery could properly range in. 6 T-34s came straight down the valley, exactly where any competent officer would have predicted, supported by infantry and trucks. Textbook Soviet deep battle doctrine. Jim's platoon was positioned on the left flank, hull down behind a low ridge. Brenner had placed them there to provide enfilade fire against the expected attack. It was a good position, a static position, a predictable position. The T-34s ignored them, drove straight past at a range of 800 meters, focused on the American positions directly in their path. Jim watched through his binoculars as the first T-34 fired, watched an M24 Chaffee explode, turrets spinning into the air, watched the crew burn. "Commander, do we engage?" Deadeye's voice was tight. Brenner's voice crackled on the radio. "All units hold position. Wait for them to close." Jim made a decision that would define the next 3 years of his life. "Platoon, Hawthorne, advance. We're flanking." "Say again, Hawthorne? Did you say advance?" "Affirmative. Mobile attack. Hit them in the flank before they can consolidate. Move now." He switched off the company net before Brenner could countermand. "Eddie, take us forward. 40 kilometers per hour. Deadeye, target the rearmost tank. Moses, load sabot." "Captain, this is insane." Eddie's voice cracked. "This is Fuller. This is what works. Drive." Eddie drove. The 4 Pershings surged over the ridge, moving fast, hitting the T-34 column from an unexpected angle while the North Koreans were focused forward. Deadeye's first shot punched through the rear tank's engine compartment. Billy's gunner took the second T-34. The other 2 tanks in Jim's platoon killed a third and fourth. The remaining T-34s tried to turn, tried to orient on this new threat, but they were in a narrow valley with limited maneuver room. By the time they realized what was happening, it was over. 6 T-34s destroyed in 4 minutes. 0 American casualties. Jim's radio exploded with chatter, Brenner screaming, other officers confused. Somewhere in the chaos, someone was cheering. They returned to the American lines. Jim expected the worst. What he got was worse than the worst. The reckoning. The court-martial hearing was held in a tent that smelled like mildew and diesel fuel. Captain Brenner stood before a colonel Jim didn't know, face purple with rage. "Sir, Captain Hawthorne directly disobeyed my orders. He broke formation, abandoned his assigned position, and executed an unauthorized attack. This is a clear violation of military discipline and chain of command. I demand he to be relieved of command and face appropriate disciplinary action." The colonel, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the look of someone who'd seen too much paperwork and not enough war, turned to Jim. "Captain Hawthorne, is this accurate?" "Yes, sir." "You disobeyed a direct order from your commanding officer?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Jim could have lied, could have claimed he misheard, could have played it safe. He'd learned nothing. "Sir, Captain Brenner's order would have resulted in unnecessary American casualties. The enemy was exposed, vulnerable to a flanking attack. I executed that attack and destroyed 6 enemy tanks with no friendly losses. By any objective measure, the operation was successful." Brenner's face somehow got darker. "Success is not the issue. Discipline is the issue. If every officer simply decides which orders to follow..." "Captain Brenner." The colonel's voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. "You may step outside." Brenner looked like he wanted to argue. Didn't. Left. The colonel studied Jim for a long moment. "Where did you serve in the last war?" "Europe, sir. France, Belgium, Germany, Normandy to VE-Day." "Under whom?" "Initially Captain Fletcher, sir. Later Lieutenant Colonel Hayes." The colonel made a note. "Hayes speaks highly of you. Says you have excellent tactical instincts and a dangerous tendency to ignore orders you disagree with." "Yes, sir." "You understand that an army cannot function if officers simply do whatever they think is best." "Yes, sir." "But you did it anyway." "Yes, sir." The colonel removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief, put them back on. "Captain Hawthorne, I'm going to tell you something off the record. This conversation doesn't leave this tent, understood?" "Yes, sir." "You're going to get away with this. I'm going to file a report that emphasizes results and minimizes your breach of discipline. Captain Brenner will be reassigned to a position where his talents are better suited. You'll receive a quiet reprimand that won't appear in your permanent record." Jim felt relief wash over him. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. I'm not doing this because I approve of what you did. I'm doing it because we're losing this war and we can't afford to waste good officers on disciplinary bullshit." The colonel leaned forward. "But understand this, Captain. Every time you disobey an order, you tear at the fabric that holds an army together. You might be right, you might save lives, but you also teach every officer under you that orders are optional. That doctrine is negotiable. That individual judgment trumps collective discipline." He stood. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to be transferred to a new unit, one that appreciates initiative, and you're going to keep winning fights and keep questioning orders. And someday, probably soon, You're going to push too far, and someone's going to break you for it. And on that day, you'll have to decide if being right was worth the cost." Jim saluted. "Yes, sir." Outside the tent, Moses was waiting. "How bad?" "Could have been worse." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." "Colonel Bradford." The new unit was different. Jim's company was reassigned to a provisional battalion under the command of Colonel William Bradford. The name meant nothing to Jim until the first briefing. Bradford was 52 years old, tall with iron gray hair, and eyes that had seen things he didn't talk about. He stood before the assembled officers and spoke without notes. "Gentlemen, I know most of you are here because you've been problems elsewhere. Too aggressive, too innovative, too willing to question doctrine. Good, that's exactly why I requested you." He pulled down a map of Korea. "This is not World War II. The enemy is not the Wehrmacht. But they're using tactics developed by people who studied the same sources we've ignored for 30 years. Soviet deep battle theory, which came from Russian observers watching British armored exercises in the 20s. North Korean tactics, trained by Soviet advisors who learned from German prisoners who learned from Fuller and Little Hart." Bradford looked directly at Jim. "We're fighting an enemy that understands mobile warfare better than we do, and we're going to fix that or we're going to die." Questions? Jim raised his hand. "Sir, are you saying we're authorized to deviate from standard doctrine?" Bradford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Captain Hawthorne, I'm saying that doctrine is a guide, not a prison. Use your judgment. Win your fights. Keep your casualties low. If you do that, I'll protect you from the bureaucrats. If you don't, I'll hang you myself. Clear?" "Yes, sir." After the briefing, Bradford called Jim to his tent. "Sit down, Captain." Jim sat. Bradford poured 2 cups of coffee from a battered percolator, handed one to Jim. "I know who you are. Hayes wrote me about you after the war. Said you were the best tactical mind he'd ever seen and the worst officer to have in peacetime." "I'm honored, sir, I think." "You shouldn't be, because I also know your record. Reprimanded in France. Nearly court-martialed in Korea. You have a gift for being right at the worst possible moments." Bradford sipped his coffee. "I was in Germany in 1935. Observer mission. Got to watch the Wehrmacht's first major maneuvers. Saw Guderian's panzers in action. It was beautiful, Captain. Terrifying and beautiful. Tanks moving like cavalry, punching through defenses, exploiting breakthroughs. Everything Fuller wrote about, executed perfectly." He set down his cup. "I wrote a 50-page report, detailed analysis, recommendations for how we should restructure our armored forces. Want to know what happened to it? Filed and forgotten? Worse. I was told I'd been too impressed by Nazi propaganda, that the maneuvers were staged, that real combat would expose the limitations of such tactics." Bradford's jaw tightened. Then 1940 happened. France fell in 6 weeks using exactly the tactics I'd recommended we adopt. And you know what the army said? That France lost because of poor morale and political instability. Not because the Germans had better tactics. Never that. He stood, walked to the tent entrance, looked out at the Korean landscape. "I'm telling you this because you need to understand what you're up against. It's not the North Koreans. It's not the Chinese. It's our own institution. An army that would rather lose slowly using approved methods than win quickly using unapproved ones." Jim joined him at the tent entrance. "Sir, why are you helping me? Why risk your career?" Bradford was silent for a long moment. "Because someone has to. Because if all the officers who understand modern warfare get crushed by the bureaucracy, then we're finished. We'll keep fighting World War I until someone beats us so badly we can't deny it anymore." He turned to face Jim. "So here's the deal. You fight smart, you win, you keep casualties low, and I'll keep the wolves off your back for as long as I can. But eventually, Captain, they'll come for both of us. Make it count before that happens." The discovery, Operation Chromite, the Incheon landing, was Douglas MacArthur's masterpiece. The amphibious assault caught the North Koreans completely by surprise, cut their supply lines, and turned the tide of the war in a single bold stroke. Jim's battalion was part of the exploitation force, racing north from the beachhead toward Seoul. They moved fast, faster than doctrine recommended, faster than logistics could support. But Bradford had read Fuller, understood Fuller, believed in Fuller. "Speed is armor," he'd told his officers. "The faster we move, the less the enemy can react. Keep pushing." They pushed. 50 miles in 3 days. North Korean units scattered before them, unable to organize resistance, unable to predict where the Americans would strike next. It was everything Fuller had written about. The expanding torrent, the indirect approach. Strike where they're weak, bypass where they're strong, keep moving until the enemy collapses. It worked. On the fourth day, Jim's company overran a North Korean supply depot that had been abandoned so quickly that documents were still burning in oil drums outside the headquarters building. Moses and Deadeye helped Jim sort through what remained. Supply manifests, training schedules, personnel rosters, and in a locked cabinet that Eddie kicked open, training manuals. Soviet training manuals, translated into Korean. Jim opened one at random, read the title page. Armored Warfare and Offensive Operations, a manual for tank commanders. The author was listed as a Soviet colonel whose name meant nothing to Jim, but the bibliography was fascinating. Fuller, Liddell Hart, Martel, Guderian. Every name Jim recognized from his studies, from Morrison's lessons, from the library in that captured German training facility in 1945. He opened another manual, same sources, another, same sources. Moses whistled softly. Jim, these are British tactics. The communists are using British tactics. Deadeye was reading over Jim's shoulder. Not just using, they've systematized them. Look at this. They've taken Fuller's theories and turned them into step-by-step procedures. It's like they understood it better than the people who invented it. Jim sat down on an ammunition crate, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. We're fighting an enemy who learned from the same sources we ignored. They took British theory, Soviet experience, and German execution, and they've created a doctrine that we have no counter for because we never bothered to learn the original lessons. Billy Marsh entered the building, saw the manual spread across the floor. What did you find? Jim handed him a manual. Watched Billy's face as he read. Jesus Christ. Yeah. Billy looked up. Does Bradford know? He's about to. Bradford's reaction was not what Jim expected. The colonel read through the manuals carefully, making notes, occasionally nodding. When he finished, he sat back and lit a cigarette. This confirms what I've suspected for years. The Soviets sent observers to every British armor exercise in the 20s and 30s. Tukhachevsky, their tank theorist, met with Liddell Hart in 1932. They learned. They adapted. They improved. He tapped the manuals. And now they've exported it to every communist army in the world. North Korea, China, soon Vietnam, all of them using tactics that the British invented and the Americans ignored. Sir, what do we do with this information? Bradford smiled grimly. We do what we should have done 30 years ago. We learn from it. Incheon to Chosin the gamble. The advance north continued. Seoul fell. The North Korean army disintegrated. By October, American forces were approaching the Yalu River, the border with China. Jim's battalion had performed brilliantly. Low casualties, high mobility, constant pressure on the enemy. Bradford's methods worked. Fuller's principles worked. But at division headquarters, questions were being asked. Jim was called to brief the division commander, Major General Clark, on his unit's tactics. Clark was old Army, 58 years old, veteran of World War I, career built on competent but conventional command. Captain Hawthorne, your battalion's rate of advance concerns me. You are moving faster than your supply lines can support. You're bypassing enemy strongpoints instead of reducing them. You're operating with minimal reserves. Jim had prepared for this. Sir, rapid advance prevents the enemy from organizing resistance. Bypassing strongpoints allows us to collapse their entire defensive system. Minimal reserves are acceptable when you maintain initiative. That's not standard doctrine. No, sir, but it's effective doctrine. Clark studied him. You're the one who disobeyed orders at Pusan, aren't you? Yes, sir. And in France, multiple times. Yes, sir. You think you're smarter than the officers who wrote our doctrine? It was a trap. Any answer was wrong. Jim chose honesty. Sir, I think our doctrine was written for a different war. The enemy has adapted. We need to adapt faster. Clark leaned back in his chair. Captain, I'm going to tell you something. Your tactics work. Your results are impressive. But you're creating problems I'm not sure you understand. He pulled out a folder. I have 3 other battalion commanders asking why they're expected to follow doctrine when Hawthorne's unit doesn't. I have logistics officers complaining that your supply demands are unpredictable. I have a staff that thinks you're either brilliant or reckless and can't agree which. Clark closed the folder. I'm not going to stop you. Bradford has enough pull to protect you, and frankly, we need the results you're getting. But understand that you're not making friends. And the day your luck runs out, those non-friends are going to bury you. I understand, sir. Do you? Because from where I sit, you're fighting 2 wars, one against the North Koreans and one against your own army. Eventually, you'll lose one of them. Chosin Reservoir, November 1950. The Chinese intervention changed everything. 300,000 Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River in late November, hitting scattered American and UN forces with overwhelming force. Units that had been advancing confidently north suddenly found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, fighting for survival. Jim's battalion was one of the lucky ones. They were positioned near the coast, had decent supply lines, and received warning early enough to begin an organized withdrawal. Other units were not so lucky. The radio traffic was nightmare fuel. Units being overrun, supply columns ambushed, entire companies disappearing into the Korean night. Jim's company was providing rear guard for the retreat, buying time for other units to pull back. It was brutal work. The Chinese attacked in waves using terrain and darkness, accepting horrific casualties to achieve their objectives. Eddie Moretti drove the Pershing with desperate skill, backing up, repositioning, keeping them mobile while Deadeye and Moses worked the gun like a machine. They'd been in continuous contact for 6 hours when the Chinese RPG team got lucky. The shaped charge hit the front glacis, punched through a weakened section of armor, detonated inside the driver's compartment. Eddie Moretti died instantly. 20 years old, Columbia pre-law, drafted, killed in Korea. The explosion wounded Moses, shrapnel tearing through his left arm. Deadeye was thrown against the turret wall, possibly concussed. Jim's ears were ringing, blood running from his nose. But they were alive. Eddie wasn't. They got Eddie's body out, handed it to infantry following behind, took over a replacement tank from a crew that had been killed earlier, kept fighting. Somewhere in the chaos and horror, Jim found himself thinking about Fuller's book, about rapid exploitation and mobile warfare and all the elegant theory that assumed your driver wouldn't die. That assumed the human cost was acceptable. When they finally broke contact and withdrew to safer positions, Jim sat in the commander's position of the new tank and couldn't remember Eddie's face. Deadeye climbed up beside him. His glasses were gone, lost in the explosion, replaced with a spare pair that didn't fit right. Jim? First names again. It only happened when things were very bad. Yeah. What are we doing here? It was the question Miggy had asked in 1901, the question Tommy Chen never got to ask, the question Eddie died before he could answer. I don't know, Danny. That's what I thought. They sat in silence as the November cold settled over Korea. Stalemate, 1951 to 1953. The war ground down into something worse than losing. It became a stalemate, a frozen, bloody, pointless stalemate where men died for hills that would be abandoned the next week, where tactical victories meant nothing because there was no strategic objective beyond survival. Jim's battalion continued to fight well. Bradford continued to protect them, but the weight of it all was crushing. Billy Marsh was killed in April 1951. Sniper shot, clean through the temple, died before he hit the ground. Jim had served with Billy since 1943, 8 years. Billy had been green and scared at Normandy. By Korea, he was one of the best officers Jim knew. Gone in a second, Jim started writing at night, a manual, training doctrine, everything he'd learned from Fuller, from Morrison, from Bradford, from 8 years of combat. He wrote by candlelight in whatever shelter he could find, filling notebook after notebook with diagrams and explanations and desperate attempts to make sense of how to fight and win and keep people alive. Moses, arm in a sling but refusing evacuation, read the manual. This is good, Jim. This is really good. It's worthless. Army will never adopt it. Maybe not now, but someday, someone will need this. Jim kept writing. The Forbidden Manual. By June 1951, Jim had nearly 200 pages of tactical doctrine, mobile armor warfare adapted for limited conflicts, Fuller's principles updated for modern conditions, everything he'd learned written down so that maybe, possibly, the next generation wouldn't have to learn it in blood. He made copies on the battalion's mimeograph machine, distributed them to junior officers who asked, taught informal classes when Bradford allowed it. It was technically illegal, unauthorized training material, violation of regulations. Jim didn't care anymore. The manual spread. Captains passed it to lieutenants. Lieutenants studied it. Some battalion commanders heard about it and demanded copies. Others heard about it and complained. In August 1951, Jim was called before a board of inquiry. The charges were specific: distribution of unauthorized tactical doctrine, conducting training outside official channels, fomenting dissent against approved methods. The prosecution's case was simple. Jim had violated regulations. The regulations existed for good reason. Therefore, Jim should be punished. Bradford testified in Jim's defense. Explained that the manual was based on proven tactics, that it had saved lives, that it represented exactly the kind of innovation the Army needed. It didn't matter. The board found Jim guilty of all charges. The recommended punishment was reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and possible discharge. Bradford fought it, used every bit of influence he had, called in favors from officers he'd served with going back to World War I. In the end, he won, partially. Jim would not be discharged. He would not be reduced in rank, but he would be transferred to a rear echelon position. No combat command, no opportunity to spread his dangerous ideas. Bradford was furious. This is bullshit, Jim. Pure political bullshit. They were in Bradford's tent the day after the verdict. Bradford was packing. Ow. He'd been transferred too, not officially as punishment, but everyone knew the truth. Sir, you shouldn't have fought for me. You destroyed your own career. Bradford shoved papers into a footlocker. My career was dead the moment I told the truth about German tactics in 19... I've been living on borrowed time for 16 years. At least I spent it trying to fix things. He stopped packing, sat down heavily. Jim, I'm going to tell you something. The Army doesn't want officers like us. It wants obedient managers, people who follow the playbook and don't ask uncomfortable questions. You and I, we're dinosaurs. The institution will crush us because that's what institutions do. Then why keep fighting? Because someone has to. Because if everyone who understands modern warfare gives up, then we're finished. We'll keep fighting the last war until we lose the next one badly enough that it can't be ignored. Bradford reached into his footlocker, pulled out a book. Old, worn, familiar. Fuller's Plan 1919. This was my copy. I've carried it since 1936. Now I'm giving it to you. Jim took the book. Inside the cover, Bradford had written names, dates, units, a genealogy of officers who tried to change the Army and failed. Add your name to that list, Jim. And when you meet someone who gets it, who understands, pass it on. Because this fight doesn't end. It just waits for the next generation. Jim looked at the list, saw names he recognized, officers who'd been forced out, sidelined, broken by the system they'd tried to improve. Sir, what if we're wrong? What if the system is right and we're just too stubborn to see it? Bradford smiled sadly. Then a lot of good men died because we were too arrogant to obey. But I don't think we're wrong, Jim. I think we're early. And being early in the military is the same as being wrong, except your conscience stays clean. Armistice, July 1953. The Korean War ended with a whimper. No victory, no defeat. Just an armistice that restored the border to roughly where it had been 3 years and millions of casualties earlier. Jim was at a supply depot in Busan when the news came. He was 31 years old, a major in name, but a clerk in function, pushing papers and hating every minute of it. Deadeye had been medically discharged in 1952. His hearing was too damaged for tank duty. He'd written twice. Jim had written back once. What was there to say? Moses Washington had stayed in, made captain. Last Jim heard, Moses was training the new armor officers at Fort Knox, teaching the tactics Jim had written down, teaching the next generation, doing what the system wouldn't let Jim do anymore. Bradford was gone. Retired quietly in early 1953, his career ending not with honor, but with bureaucratic exile. Billy was dead. Eddie was dead. Miggy and Tommy and Ashford and dozens of others, whose names Jim could barely remember, were dead. And for what? Jim sat in his office at the supply depot, Bradford's copy of Fuller's Plan 1919 on the desk beside his own completed manual, and tried to feel something. He failed. A knock on the door, a young lieutenant, maybe 23, nervous. Sir, Major Hawthorne? Yes. Sir, some of the officers were talking and they said you wrote a manual about tank tactics. And I was wondering if maybe I could get a copy. I'm shipping to Germany next month and I want to be prepared. Jim looked at the kid, saw himself at 19, scared and ignorant, and trying so hard to do right. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out one of the last remaining copies of his manual. Take it, study it, understand it. The lieutenant took the manual like it was sacred scripture. Sir, is it true you served with Patton? No, I served with better men than Patton. You've never heard of them. The lieutenant left. Jim sat alone in his office. Outside, the war was over. Men were going home. The Korean peninsula was divided, a problem deferred for another generation. Jim put Bradford's book and his own manual into his footlocker, locked it, prepared to return to the United States in a peacetime army that didn't want him and a marriage that was already dead. Moses appeared in the doorway, Jim hadn't seen him in 8 months. Moses looked older, tired, wearing captain's bars now. Heard you were here. Wanted to say goodbye before I rotate home. Moses, good to see you. They shook hands. Moses saw the footlocker. Packing up? Yeah, going back to the world, whatever that means. Moses sat down without being asked. Jim, I've been thinking about what you've been teaching, about why the brass fought you so hard. And? And I think they're scared, not of losing, of changing. Because if they admit you were right, they have to admit they were wrong, and institutions can't do that. It destroys them. Moses leaned forward. But that doesn't mean you were wrong, it means you were early. And maybe 20 years from now, some kid is going to read what you wrote and realize it works. And maybe he'll save lives because you were too stubborn to give up. Jim wanted to believe that, couldn't quite manage it. Moses, Eddie Moretti died in my tank. Billy Marsh died following my tactics. How many others? And for what? A war we didn't win. Something nobody will read. A career that's over before I'm 35. Moses stood up. You know what Eddie said to me the night before he died? He said, the captain's crazy, but at least he's trying. That's what you did, Jim. You tried. In a war where nobody was trying anything except surviving. You tried to do it better. That matters. He walked to the door, stopped. I'm staying in, making a career of it, going to Fort Knox, training the next generation. And I'm keeping my copy of what you wrote. Someday somebody's going to ask me how to fight with tanks, and I'm going to teach them your way. Because it's the right way, even if it takes 30 years for the brass to figure that out. He extended his hand. Take care of yourself, Jim, and don't give up. The fight's not over. It's just changing shape. They shook hands one last time. Jim watched him walk away into the Korean afternoon, not knowing it was the last time he'd see Moses Washington alive. Jim sat alone with his locked footlocker and the weight of 3 wars. 3 wars, 2 continents, 10 years of combat, and what had changed? Nothing. Everything. He couldn't tell anymore. The Korean War was over. Jim Hawthorne's war against institutional stupidity had just begun. But wars you can't win are just tragedies in slow motion. Jim closed his eyes and tried to remember why he'd ever thought any of it mattered. Fort Knox, Kentucky, January 1906. Jim Hawthorne was 42 years old the day he volunteered to go back to war. His marriage had ended officially in 1954, though it had really died somewhere in Korea. His son, James Jr., was 17 and hadn't spoken to him in 3 years except through lawyers and child support checks. The boy was angry. Jim understood that. He'd been an absent father, choosing wars over family, choosing dead men's lessons over a living child. Sarah had remarried, a dentist from Omaha. Safe, stable, everything Jim wasn't. His career was a graveyard of promising starts and bureaucratic endings. He'd spent 12 years teaching at Fort Knox, teaching kids who'd never seen combat how to fight wars they didn't understand, teaching doctrine he didn't believe in to officers who didn't want to learn. The telegram had arrived 3 months ago. Captain Moses Washington, killed in training accident. Fort Knox, October 1965. Crushed when a tank threw a track during maintenance. 43 years old, 22 years of service. Jim had gone to the funeral, stood in the back. Moses' widow had looked at him once, her eyes full of questions Jim couldn't answer. Why did good men keep dying? What had any of it been for? Moses had been teaching Jim's methods to young officers. Right up until the end, fighting the same fight, alone. The gray was winning in Jim's hair. His hands shook some mornings. The faces of dead men visited him at night. Now Moses joined them. When the call came for experienced armor officers to volunteer for Vietnam advisory duty, everyone expected Jim to stay silent. He was old, he was bitter, he'd done his time. Jim raised his hand. The personnel officer looked confused. Major Hawthorne, you're aware this is combat duty in an active war zone? I'm aware. You're also aware that at your age and rank, you could easily remain stateside until retirement? I'm aware of that too. Then why volunteer? Jim thought about Eddie Moretti, about Billy Marsh, about Bradford and Moses and all the others who'd fought for something better. Because Moses isn't here to teach them anymore. Someone has to. 3 weeks later, he shipped out to Vietnam. Long Binh, South Vietnam, March 1966. Vietnam was everything Korea wasn't. Korea had been cold and industrial, a real war with front lines and objectives. Vietnam was hot and agricultural, a nightmare of insurgency where the enemy could be anyone and nowhere and everywhere. Jim's assignment was to command an M48 Patton tank company supporting operations in the Mekong Delta. The Army brass said tanks were useless in jungle warfare. Jim suspected the Army brass had never read Fuller. His company inherited a collection of battle-worn M48s and even more battle-worn crews. The average age was 21. Most had been in country less than 6 months. None had ever fought in a real tank battle. His gunner was a corporal named Ray Chen. No relation to Tommy Chen, who died in Normandy, but the name hit Jim like shrapnel anyway. His driver was PFC Marcus Clay, 19 years old, from Detroit, drafted 6 months ago, already counting days until he could leave. His loader was Specialist Frank Delgado, 22, Texas, whose brother had died at Ayadrang. They were good kids, scared kids, kids who needed someone to teach them how to survive. Jim's executive officer was a Green lieutenant named Thomas Brennan, 24 years old, West Point class of 1964, full of theory and doctrine and absolutely no understanding of how men actually died. Brennan reminded Jim painfully of himself at 19, before Normandy taught him that courage without knowledge just gets you killed faster. Sir, I've studied the armor manual. I know we are supposed to provide mobile fire support, but I'm not clear on how that applies in jungle terrain with limited sight lines. And Jim cut him off. Forget the manual. The manual was written for fighting Russians in Germany. This is different. But sir, doctrine is doctrine. It exists for a reason. Jim looked at the young officer and saw 20 years of the same argument. Lieutenant, I'm going to teach you how tanks really work, how they move, how they fight, how they keep you alive. It won't all be in the manual. Some of it will contradict the manual. You can follow the manual and maybe die, or trust me and maybe live. Your choice. Brennan's face showed confusion, doubt, but also desperate hope. I'll trust you, sir. Good, because we don't have time for anything else. The education. Jim trained his company the way Morrison had trained him, the way Bradford had tried to teach the Army. Fuller's principles adapted for jungle warfare. Tanks weren't fortresses. They were hammers. Hit hard, move fast, never stay where the enemy expects you. Don't advance on roads. Roads are death traps. Use them for speed, not for security. Combined arms always. Tank alone is a target. Tank with infantry is a weapon system. The crews learned. Slowly at first, then faster. They ran exercises in the paddies and rubber plantations, learning how to move through terrain the manual said was impassable. Brennan absorbed it all like a sponge, asked questions, took notes, reminded Jim of himself before the cynicism set in. Sir, why don't they teach this at Fort Knox? Because the people teaching at Fort Knox never fought like this. They fought the last war, or they didn't fight at all. But you're teaching at Fort Knox. You could change the curriculum. Jim almost laughed. Lieutenant, I've been trying to change the curriculum for 20 years. The Army doesn't want change. It wants compliance. That seems inefficient. Welcome to the military, son. Operation Junction City, February 1967. The big offensive came in February. Operation Junction City, one of the largest American operations of the war. Jim's company was part of the armored element supporting the infantry sweep through War Zone C. The plan was conventional. Advance on schedule, clear designated areas, establish fire support bases. Textbook. Predictable. Exactly what the enemy would expect. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harris Vance, was 48 years old, career officer, more politician than soldier. He explained the operation to his officers with maps and arrows and absolute certainty. We advance at 0600, 2 companies abreast. Armor provides mobile fire support. Any questions? Jim studied the map, saw the obvious ambush points, saw where the enemy would hit them. Sir, if we advance on this schedule, we'll be predictable. We should vary our movement, probe with reconnaissance, force the enemy to reveal positions before we commit. Vance looked at him like he'd suggested retreating. Major Hawthorne, we're not going to cowboy this operation. We follow the plan. We maintain unit integrity. We advance by the book. Sir, Fuller's doctrine clearly states that I don't care about some British theorist from 50 years ago. I care about current U.S. Army doctrine. We advance as planned. That's final. After the briefing, Brennan pulled Jim aside. Sir, you're right. That advance route is suicide. I know. So what do we do? Jim looked at the young lieutenant, saw himself in France and Korea, always facing the same choice. Obey and watch men die, or disobey and face the consequences. We follow orders, Lieutenant, and we hope I'm wrong. But Jim wasn't wrong. The ambush. The Viet Cong hit them 3 hours into the advance, exactly where Jim had predicted. RPGs from tree lines on both flanks, mines on the road, small arms fire pinning the infantry. Classic L-shaped ambush, executed perfectly. Harris's tank, Second in the column was hit immediately. RPG through the side armor. The vehicle didn't explode, but it stopped, smoke pouring from the engine. Jim's radio exploded with traffic, vehicles immobilized, infantry pinned, casualties mounting, Vance screaming contradictory orders. Jim made a decision. All Hawthorne elements, break right, aggressive maneuver, hit the tree line, suppress the RPG teams. Hawthorne, this is Vance. Hold your position. Do not break formation. Jim switched to company net only. Execute now, move! His 4 tanks surged off the road, into the paddy, moving fast through water that was supposed to stop them. They hit the tree line from an unexpected angle, caught the VC fighters repositioning, shattered the ambush with machine gun fire and canister rounds. The attack broke. The enemy melted into the jungle. American casualties were bad but not catastrophic. Jim's company had saved the convoy. He'd also disobeyed direct orders. Again. This time, there would be no Colonel Bradford to save him. The price. The meeting was in an air-conditioned trailer that felt obscene after the heat of combat. Lieutenant Colonel Vance sat behind a desk. Behind him stood a colonel Jim didn't know, and a brigadier general who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Major Hawthorne, you disobeyed a direct order during combat operations. This is the most serious charge an officer can face. Do you have anything to say? Jim could have apologized, could have claimed confusion, could have played politics. He was too old and too tired. Sir, your advance plan was predictable. The enemy ambushed us exactly where any competent tactician would have expected. I executed a maneuver that broke the ambush and saved American lives. If that's a crime, I'm guilty. Vance's face went purple. You think you're smarter than everyone else. You think your British theories make you a tactical genius. You've been insubordinate your entire career. The brigadier general held up a hand. Major Hawthorne, step outside. Jim obeyed. He waited in the heat for 2 hours, watching helicopters come and go, watching young soldiers who had no idea how close they'd come to dying because of incompetent leadership. Finally, the door opened. The brigadier general gestured him inside. Vance was gone. The colonel remained, face unreadable. The general spoke quietly. Major Hawthorne, Lieutenant Colonel Vance has requested your court-martial. He's also requested you be relieved of command immediately. Jim nodded. He'd expected this. However, I've reviewed the after-action reports. I've spoken to Lieutenant Brennan and your other officers. They all say the same thing. You saved lives today. Your tactics worked. The general paused. I'm not going to court-martial you, but I also can't let this stand. You violated the chain of command. You undermined your superior officer. You set a precedent that cannot be allowed in a military organization. Yes, sir. I'm relieving you of command. You'll be transferred to a staff position. No more combat duty. You'll finish your tour pushing papers, and then you'll retire. That's the best I can do. Jim felt something break inside. Not anger, not even sadness, just exhaustion. Sir, may I speak freely? Go ahead. I've spent 24 years trying to teach this army how to fight better, how to keep soldiers alive. I've been punished for it in 3 different wars. And you know what? I'm done. You want me in a staff position? Fine. You want me to retire? Perfect. Because clearly this institution would rather protect incompetent officers than listen to competent ones. The general's expression didn't change. You're probably right, Major, but that doesn't change the reality. Dismissed. Last mission, May 1968. Jim spent the next year at a logistics desk in Saigon, pushing papers, processing reports, dying slowly of irrelevance. Lieutenant Brennan wrote to him twice. The second letter arrived in May 1968. Sir, I wanted you to know that I've been teaching your methods to my platoon. The maneuver tactics, the combined arms approach, everything you taught me. It works. We've had 0 casualties in 4 months. Thank you for everything. Respectfully, L.T. Thomas Brennan. Jim folded the letter carefully, put it in his footlocker next to Bradford's copy of Fuller and his own battered manual. 2 weeks later, the casualty report crossed his desk. First Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, killed in action. His platoon had been reassigned to a different company. The new company commander had ordered a conventional advance on a suspected enemy position. Brennan had followed orders this time. The enemy had been waiting. Jim read the report 3 times. Each time, the words stayed the same. He walked out of his office, past the rows of desks and filing cabinets and air conditioning that protected staff officers from the reality of war. He found a quiet corner behind the headquarters building and vomited until there was nothing left inside. Forced retirement, 1973. Jim Hawthorne retired from the U.S. Army in July 1973. 29 years of service, 3 wars, no honors, no ceremony, just paperwork and a reduced pension and a handshake from an officer who didn't know his name. He was 49 years old and felt 70. He moved back to Nebraska, rented a small house outside Lincoln, got a job at a garage, fixing cars and tractors, working with his hands because thinking hurt too much. His son never called. His ex-wife had remarried. The men he'd served with were scattered, dead, or had forgotten him. Dead-Eye Kowalski sent a Christmas card every year. They never said much. Still alive, hope you are too. Jim kept his foot locker in the bedroom closet. Bradford's Fuller, his manual, letters from officers who'd learned from him. Evidence that he'd existed, that he'd tried, that it had mattered. Most days he didn't believe it. The letter 1982. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 9 years after Jim retired. Official U.S. Army letterhead, Fort Knox, Kentucky, from a colonel Jim had never heard of. Jim almost threw it away. The Army had taken enough from him. He didn't need more reminders. But something made him open it. Dear Major Hawthorne, I am writing to inform you that the U.S. Army has recently adopted a new armored warfare doctrine called air-land battle. This doctrine emphasizes rapid maneuver, deep strikes, and combined arms operations. During the development process, we reviewed historical training materials, including an unofficial document that had circulated among armor officers in the 1950s and 60s. We believe you were the author. Sir, your work significantly influenced our thinking. The operational concepts you outlined form the foundation of how we will fight the next war. I wanted you to know that, and to thank you. Many of us wish you had been officially recognized for this contribution during your service. Perhaps this letter, inadequate as it is, can begin to remedy that oversight. One of my instructors here was trained by Captain Moses Washington. Captain Washington spoke of you often, apparently. He told his students that everything worth knowing about armored warfare he learned from a stubborn major who wouldn't quit even when the system tried to break him. We're teaching your methods now, sir, to every armor officer in the U.S. Army. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your innovation. Thank you for not giving up. Respectfully, Colonel James Mitchell, Commandant, Armor School, Fort Knox. Jim read the letter sitting at his kitchen table. Read it again. A third time. His hands were shaking, not from age, from something else. He walked to his bedroom, opened the footlocker, pulled out his document. The pages were yellow now. The binding cracked, but the words were still there. The operational concepts, Morrison's lessons, Bradford's sacrifice, 29 years of fighting to teach an institution that wouldn't listen. And Moses, teaching Jim's methods until the day he died, never giving up, never forgetting. And now they'd listened. 10 years too late for Brennan, 12 years too late for Moses, 30 years too late for Bradford. But they'd listened. Jim sat on the floor of his bedroom, holding the pages, and for the first time since Moses' funeral, he cried. Desert Storm, 1991. Jim watched the Gulf War on television like every other American. Watched M1 Abrams tanks race across a rocky desert. Watched them flank, exploit, penetrate exactly as Fuller had written 70 years ago. Watched them destroy the Iraqi army in 100 hours. Dead-Eye called him that night. They were both 67 years old now. Did you see it, Jim? I saw it. That's your doctrine. That's everything you tried to teach them. Jim was silent for a long moment. Yeah, it is. You should feel proud. Should I? Moses died before he saw this. Brennan died before he saw this. How many others? Dead-Eye's voice was gentle. But some lived because of you. That young captain who wrote you last year. The one who said your manual saved his platoon. He lived. His men lived. Men? It took them 40 years, Danny. Yeah, but they got there because you wouldn't quit. After the call, Jim walked to his garage, pulled out the old Sherman tank shell he'd kept since 1944. The one he'd engraved with names, Miggy, Eddie, Moses, Ashford, Bradford. He added another name, Brennan. Then he set the shell on a shelf where he could see it. Evidence, witness, testament. Fort Benning, Georgia, 2003. The phone call came in spring 2003. Jim was 79 years old, living in a veteran's home because his heart was failing and he couldn't manage alone anymore. Mr. Hawthorne, this is Captain David Morrison. I'm stationed at Fort Benning. I'm teaching armored tactics here, and I'm the grandson of Captain Richard Morrison. My grandfather spoke about you often before he died in 1987. He said you were the best tactical mind he ever met. Jim felt something stir. Morrison, the man who'd started everything. Gone 16 years now. Your grandfather was a good man, Captain. The best teacher I ever had. He left me some of his papers, including a letter he wrote in 1985, 2 years before the stroke. He said that if I ever had the chance, I should find you. Thank you for carrying forward the work he started, for never giving up even when the institution tried to break you. Jim's throat was tight. I gave up plenty of times, son. I just kept coming back. That's what Grandpa said you'd say. He wrote, Jim Hawthorne is too stubborn to stay quit. The captain paused. Sir, there's a young officer here, Iraq veteran. He used air-land battle doctrine in combat, saved his entire platoon. He wanted to meet the man whose ideas made it possible. Would you be willing to visit Fort Benning? The Army would like to honor you. Quietly, no press, just soldiers who understand what you did. Jim almost said no, almost hung up, almost let it end quietly. Then he thought about Bradford, about Moses, about Brennan, about Morrison, dead 16 years, still trying to set things right. All right, Captain, I'll come. For your grandfather. The ceremony. They held it at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning. Small ceremony, some officers, some historians, no press, no politicians. They gave Jim a plaque, thanked him for his contribution to modern armored warfare doctrine. Let him shake hands with young officers who'd used his methods in Iraq. One of them, a captain named Rodriguez, pulled Jim aside. Sir, I read your original manual. Someone at Fort Knox had a copy in the archives. It saved my life. I was in Fallujah, 2004. We used your flank maneuver principles. Got out with 0 casualties. Jim looked at the young officer, 28 years old, alive, whole. You follow doctrine now? Yes, sir, because it's good doctrine. Because it's your doctrine. After the ceremony, they took Jim to the armor collection, showed him the restored tanks, Sherman, Pershing, M48 Patton, M1 Abrams, the progression of steel, the evolution of warfare. Jim stood in front of a Sherman, identical to the one he'd commanded in France. Touched the armor. Cold, solid, silent. A museum piece now, but once it had been home, had been survival, had been hope. Captain Morrison appeared beside him. Sir, was it worth it? All those years fighting the system? Jim thought about the question. The same question Moses had asked in Korea. The same question he'd asked himself 1,000 times. Ask the men who came home, Captain. I'm asking you. Jim looked at the young officer, saw himself at 19, saw Brennan at 24, saw all the others who tried and failed and died trying. I don't know, but I couldn't stop because if I stopped, who would teach the next guy? And if nobody teaches him, he learns it in blood. So I guess the question isn't whether it was worth it to me, it's whether it was worth it to him. He pointed at the Sherman. Somewhere in Iraq, a kid like I was is commanding a tank like that. Well, better than that. And he's using tactics that work. That keep him alive. That get him home. If that happened because I wouldn't shut up and follow orders, then yeah, it was worth it. Morrison smiled. My grandfather said you'd say something like that. Your grandfather was usually right. They walked through the museum together. Past the tanks, past the weapons, past the photographs of men who'd fought and died and somehow, improbably, changed the world by refusing to accept that the old way was the only way. The Garage, 2003. Jim returned to the veterans' home that evening. Tired, old, feeling every one of his 79 years. But also feeling something else. Something he'd lost somewhere between Korea and Vietnam and the long years after. Purpose, maybe, or peace. Hard to tell the difference at this age. He opened his footlocker, looked at the contents. Bradford's Fuller, his manual, letters, photographs, the accumulated weight of a life spent fighting battles most people never knew existed. He picked up the engraved shell, ran his fingers over the names. Miggy, Eddie, Moses, Ashford, Bradford, Brennan. Added one more name, Jim, not because he was dead, because he was finally done. The fight was over. Whose doctrine was written. The next generation was trained. The lessons had been learned, paid for in blood, written in loss, preserved despite everything. He'd won. Sort of. In the way you win when the institution finally admits you were right after everyone who agreed with you is dead. It was the best victory soldiers like him ever got. Last words. Jim Hawthorne died in his sleep 6 months later. Heart failure. Quick. Painless. The way soldiers pray to die after they've seen the alternatives. Deadeye Kowalski came to the funeral. 79 years old, nearly deaf, but still standing straight. He was the only one from the old crew left. James Jr. came too. First time Jim had seen his son in 15 years. The boy was 44 now, not a boy anymore. A father himself, working as an accountant in Denver, safe, stable, everything Jim had never been. They didn't speak, just stood on opposite sides of the grave, two strangers connected by blood and separated by everything else. They buried Jim in a veteran cemetery outside Lincoln. Simple headstone. Name, rank, years of service. No mention of the wars he'd fought against his own army. No mention of the document that had changed doctrine. No mention of any of it. Just a soldier's grave among thousands of others. Deadeye stood over the grave after everyone else had left. Almost everyone. James Jr. lingered at a distance, uncertain. Deadeye spoke quietly, knowing the son was listening. We made it, Jim, all the way through, you, me, and those ideas we carried. We actually changed something. Took 40 years, but we did it. He pulled out a small object from his pocket, a piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times it was falling apart. The first page of Jim's work, the introduction. The principles of war remain constant. The methods of war change with technology. Those who adapt survive. Those who don't, die. This exists so that the next generation doesn't have to learn in blood what we learned in fire. Deadeye set the paper on the grave. You kept your promise, Commander. You taught them, and they lived because you did. He saluted, held it longer than regulation required. James Jr. approached as Deadeye turned to leave. Sergeant Kowalski. Deadeye stopped, surprised the son knew his name. Your father saved my life. 17 times I can count. Probably more I don't know about. He was the best man I ever served with. The son's voice was quiet. He was a terrible father. Yeah, probably was. War does that, takes the best parts of a man and uses them up on strangers. Doesn't leave much for family. James Jr. looked at the grave. Should I be proud of him or angry? Deadeye considered that. Both. He earned both. Your father spent 40 years fighting to keep soldiers alive. He just forgot that sons need fathers alive too. He put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. But he never forgot the soldiers. And because of that, kids like you never had to be drafted, never had to learn what your father learned. That was his gift, not to you, to your generation. Deadeye walked away, leaving father and son to whatever peace they could find. James Jr. stood alone at the grave for a long time, finally spoke, voice barely a whisper. I still don't understand you, Dad, but maybe that's okay. He turned and left. The cemetery settled into silence. Epilogue, Fort Benning, 2012. The National Armor and Cavalry Museum dedicated a small exhibit in 2012 to the development of air-land battle doctrine. One section featured the original copy of Jim Hawthorne's manual, donated by Deadeye Kowalski's family after he died in 2008. Next to it, a photograph. 5 men standing in front of a Sherman tank. France, 1944. Jim, Deadeye, Miggy, Tommy Chen, and Billy Marsh. All of them young, all of them alive in that frozen moment. The placard read, Major James Hawthorne, author of the foundational text for modern American armored warfare. His unauthorized training manual, written during the Korean War, formed the basis for the revolutionary air-land battle doctrine adopted in 1982. Though never officially recognized during his lifetime, Hawthorne's work saved countless lives by teaching principles of maneuver warfare that the U.S. Army had neglected for decades. Thousands of soldiers passed that exhibit every year. Most didn't stop. Some did. A few read the whole thing. And occasionally a young armor officer would stand in front of that photograph and the worn manual and think about the price of being right too early, about the cost of fighting your own institution, about whether one man with the courage to question authority could actually change anything. The answer, written in blood across 3 wars and 40 years of institutional resistance, was simple. Yes, but not for himself, for everyone who came after. That was the soldier's bargain, the only one that mattered. Fight, teach, die. Hope that someone remembers why. Jim Hawthorne had kept his end. The rest was up to the next generation. End.